Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone, still for another 10 minutes. Matt, thank you very much for the kind intro, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to all of you. My name is Gus Tugendhat, and as Matt said, I'm the founder of Tussell. After a career spent in investment banking and the business information industry, I set up Tussell in 2015 to fill the gap for useful and reliable information on public contracting. A niche, some people said when I set up the business, but a niche accounting for 10% of UK GDP, I reply. I like to call public procurement the biggest market hiding in plain sight. Since I set up the company, we've become the market's trusted source of data on government contracting. For example, when you read a story in the press about the volume of new contracts for the inspection of RAC, or the largest suppliers exposed to Birmingham City Council, or which Big Four firm earns the most from government on an annual basis, then it's certainly our data that the article is based on. My main message to you today is this: you're lucky to be sitting here. That's got nothing to do with me. It's because now is a historically good time to be collaborating with the public sector. I say that partly because the alternative of selling to the public sector, selling directly to consumers or to the companies serving them, is getting much, much harder for all the reasons that we're well aware of: the cost of living, inflation, and other headwinds at home and abroad. So, when I say that you're at the right place at the right time, it's mostly on account of three mega trends. And I'm going to look a bit beyond kind of AI and some of the other things. I'm going to focus on a kind of time span of decades here for a second. But it's mostly on account of three mega trends which are going to shape our lives in the coming decades and change the role of the state within our lives. Those three mega trends are decarbonising the economy, which in spite of Rishi Sunak's recent kind of pullback is something which is happening and needs to happen and has very far-reaching implications. Number two is adapting to quite a rapidly ageing population and the pressure that that's going to put on healthcare and social care, to name just two areas. And the third mega trend is rearming to meet the military threats that have seemed inconceivable in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. These mega trends are akin to the transformation of society that took place in 1945 after the end of the Second World War, the period that gave rise to the welfare state. In short, we are living in an era of big government. The times require the sort of interventionist state that hauled the economy out of the depths of the pandemic, that can build wind farms and power stations, that can come up with a new settlement for social care and keep up with the demand for critical care, that can devote at least 2% of GDP to NATO while also sending enough arms for Ukraine to defend itself and patrolling the South China Sea. And the good news is that the government cannot achieve these goals without all of you in the room. Per the title of today's conference, we must help the government to build a state that is not just bigger, but also smarter. So, historically, selling to the public sector wasn't that sexy. But now you find yourselves covering a government marketplace that is bigger than ever before that is characterized by the provision of steady, essential services, not fads, and where growth is going to be driven by three of the megatrends I've mentioned and other kind of smaller ones. But that's not all. One other factor makes selling to government quite different to selling to the private sector, and that's transparency. The government, to its credit, holds itself accountable to levels of openness that provide a staggering amount of insight into your markets, your customers, and even your competitors. Why would you not take advantage of that? And that is where we at Tussell come in. We believe that the best way to position yourself for success in this growing market is, quite simply, to know your customers inside out. To be able to answer questions like, who is buying the products and services that I'm selling? How much are they spending? Who are their incumbent suppliers? When do the live contracts come up for renewal? Which framework should I be on? Is the tender that I'm bidding on is that tender really worth bidding on? And who makes IT purchasing decisions in this ministry or that local council? So, the presentation I'm going to give you today is a high-level illustration of how to map your addressable market in the public sector. I'd like you to come out of this session not just having heard a pitch, but knowing more about your revenue opportunity than when you came in. So let's put that to the test. I won't dwell on this. For those of you who hadn't heard about Tussell until 5 minutes ago, we're a London-based scale-up, and though we're still quite small, we are privileged to do business with most of the top suppliers to government across a range of sectors, but IT and consulting in particular. Our data is so good that the government relies on it to better understand their own spend, suppliers, transparency, compliance, etc. And as I mentioned, our data was cited in the press a mere 260 times last year. All the data I'm about to show you is based on turning open data published by the government into useful data that you can use to make decisions on and take actions from. So everything I'm going to show you can be audited, can be defended, and can be traced back to a contract, a tender, or even an invoice. So be careful about punching back on the data because I can defend it too. So let's start nice and broad with just kind of how big the market is and how fast it's growing. I'm just going to focus on the last bar for the fiscal year ending March 2022. We've since updated it for another year, but we did this presentation a while ago and we just kind of froze the data at that point. In the most recent year, the government spent a whopping £18 billion, give or take, with IT and telecoms companies. IT accounted for about 85% of the total, and the market grew by a chunk in year one of COVID, and then far from giving up those gains, it simply locked them in and carried on growing from there. So the market has been structurally expanded by the pandemic for all the kind of reasons around kind of digital adoption and working from home that we are all aware of. This slide is a kind of high-level breakdown of what we call the buyer types. I don't think it'll come as any surprise that central government accounts for about 50% of the total IT procurement market by expenditure. This is all based not on contract values, which are very lumpy and a bit misleading, especially some of the framework stuff. This is based on invoices being paid by everything from ministerial bodies through to police forces to suppliers to companies like some of those in the room today. The main thing which catches my eye on this slide is actually the changing relationship between IT expenditure in the NHS, which you can see in blue, which has gone from 16% of the market in year 1 to nearly a quarter of the market in year 5, gradually kind of substituting IT spend from within local government. So it is hard to deny that austerity is not having an impact on local government. And I think that's very sad, and I think the implications of that are actually being felt by many citizens every day. You can see that breakdown by buyer type even more clearly on this slide here. Worth pointing out that the NHS IT expenditure by the NHS has grown by 119% between 2018 and 2022. That's absolutely massive. Blue light grew by a similar rate, but from a much smaller base. Local government, in spite of austerity, has not actually got smaller in absolute terms. It did grow very slightly over the period, but much less quickly than the public sector market at large. So anybody selling into that part of the market has to develop BD strategies based more on taking kind of market share than on absolute growth in expenditure of the type that we're seeing in the NHS and elsewhere. So data like this helps you to challenge or validate where you are allocating resources and what kind of BD strategies you will require in order to grow your top line in that chosen market. This slide looks at exactly the same expenditure, but this time from the supplier point of view instead of the buyer or commissioner point of view. I'm going to start with the orange line, which is going down. That refers to the absolute spend or the absolute kind of public sector revenue being earned by the top 10 GSIs or system integrators. Many of them are in this room. Many of them are clients of ours, so I have to be careful about what I say. But the data is the data, and what it's showing is that as a cohort, their revenue is broadly flat over the period, but it hasn't been growing much, and therefore, overall, that cohort is losing market share in a growing market. And the reason I think it's losing market share is because central government, in particular, has got much better at developing some of those capabilities in-house. And we heard about some of the agony and ecstasy of kind of delivering on these digital programs this morning in the talk. But by and large, the government is getting better at purchasing this stuff, building these kind of in-house SI capabilities, and that means it relies less on the SIs themselves to do it, and therefore can do more kind of purchasing directly from the technology vendors, the likes of Google and AWS, to name a couple. And that's why we see the pink line going up. And it's also doing a lot more kind of transactional purchasing of IT via the big IT resellers. And that's why you're seeing the blue line go up quite sharply. So the supply landscape is really evolving kind of probably more quickly than people realize. The line at the bottom in green is the spend, the absolute spend directly with SMEs. SMEs are earning more than twice the amount in the last year as they did in the first year, but their market share is actually growing quite slowly. And I think that kind of represents the challenge for big buyers in central government of spending money directly with SMEs. The will is there, but in practice, it's quite hard. So if you're an SME, data like this helps you to understand which partners, which companies you should be partnering with in order to bring your innovative solutions to market, to reach the audience, the end audience that you want to sell to. And if you're a very large company, then data like this also helps you to understand which SMEs you should be trying to kind of lure into your supply chain. The government is very serious about social value, and the more that you can position yourselves as a conduit for subcontracting business to innovative local companies based wherever you are deploying your solution, I think the more kind of attractive and competitive you can make your bid. So there ought to be a real symbiosis between large companies and small ones, even if not that much spend is yet going directly to the SMEs. This is an example of I should say that on any of the slides I've shown, we've got a massive screen in the room behind you, and on that screen you can come up and then we can drill into any of those parts of government. So you can click into central government and you can see how much HMRC is spending versus how much the Home Office, or whether councils in the northwest are spending more on IT than in the northeast. So this is necessarily quite high level, but it's possible to drill into the data to see exactly what you want. We're not showing the top suppliers here, though you can see it on the screen, but we are showing some of the companies that we call challengers. They're not necessarily the biggest in terms of absolute IT revenue from the government, but they are some of the companies that are growing the fastest. And it's really nice to see companies in there like Kainos, which are adding a lot of value, working mostly with central government bodies on their kind of digital transformation, or Epic, which is working with a lot of NHS trusts on electronic patient records and such like. So this isn't just kind of relevant to the big companies, this is also all about the kind of high growth, smaller ones. Just slightly shifting gears here, everything I've talked to you about so far has been based on invoice level spend data, so kind of equivalent to your revenue. On this slide, we're flipping to contracts. And the reason we're flipping to looking at contracts is because that is what you analyze to see how much is being purchased through frameworks. And I don't think this comes as a surprise to anyone, but frameworks, as opposed to open competition, now account for about 56% of all IT and telecoms purchasing across the wider public sector. It's much higher in the NHS than it is in local government. Central government is somewhere in between. But if you're not on the right frameworks, or you're not partnering with someone who is, then this slide is a kind of signal that you may well be missing out on potential opportunities. I'm not here to say that frameworks are the best thing since sliced bread. I think the idea was good. In practice, there's been a lot of proliferation, and I'm not sure that buyers always know which frameworks they should be using, and I'm not sure that suppliers always know which frameworks they should be using. But they are being used, and making sure that you're on the right ones is quite important, as this slide demonstrates. This slide shows the top 5 frameworks used for purchasing IT in relation to one another. So they're not the only 5, they're just the top 5. And you can see here kind of which are the big ones. But the other things that you can see from this is also kind of, just simple calculations about the average size of the contracts. So G-Cloud is used primarily to kind of purchase a pretty high, steady volume of relatively low value contracts. Technology Services 3 is used to purchase lower volume, much higher contracts, and the same applies to Digital Capability for Health framework in the bottom right-hand corner. If you were to go into our product and you would say which frameworks are used to purchase cyber, it would look different again. And if you said which frameworks are used to purchase cloud, it would pivot again. So the right frameworks to be on depend on what you are selling and which audience you want to reach. The MOJ might use different frameworks to the Home Office. NHS uses different frameworks to local government. So they were not all created equally, and it's important that you distinguish between them. This is my penultimate slide, and it's a kind of forward-looking slide. The best way to win business tomorrow is to start rolling the pitch today. And the best way to know what opportunities you can win tomorrow is not by having a crystal ball or a time machine, or even necessarily paying millions of pounds to consultants. Try doing something quite simple, like looking at all live contracts based on their contract expiration date. And that's not a guarantee that that live contract will come up for renewal, let alone that it will be re-tendered or such like. A lot of contracts, even services contracts, may reach an end of their natural life, or there are inbuilt extension clauses and such like. But your job is to preempt future demand and to start making the case for why you can offer better services or better value. In total, I said I'd use the laser beamer. In total, there are £3.5 billion worth of live services, IT contracts coming up for renewal in the next 2 years, spread across just over 2,000 contracts. What I would advise you to do is to kind of access that data and then query it for contracts in your sweet spot. That might mean anything mentioning DevOps, or anything mentioning digital transformation, or anything mentioning AI, or anything above 1 million but smaller than 5 million, or in local government, or in the NHS in the Southwest, or any live contract that was won by your competitor, and you want to access your competitor's book of business and pick off their contracts one by one. So you can do it based on based on the solution being purchased, based on the profile of the customer, or based on the profile of the incumbent. And even if only 10% of these contracts are really viable opportunities to put into your pipeline, that is probably a surer, quicker, more effective way to build your kind of 12, 24-month pipeline than anything else that you could do today. So I guess the punchline of this presentation is that thanks to the transparency of the UK government, which of course could be better, but which is very good and work in progress, there is access to open data that companies like us have turned into useful data so that you can make better decisions and get busy collaborating with the public sector to deliver on the innovation that we've been talking about today and will continue talking about. And I remind you that my team and I are at the back of in the room behind, and you can come over, click into our dashboard and just kind of follow the money, to use a phrase. Thank you very much. I'm going to take some questions now with some help from Matt.
Great. Thanks very much, Gus. I'm sure that all the audience, whether public or private sector, can probably chip in on some of the framework points that you were starting to raise there. But are there any questions from the audience to Gus, or I can use my chair's prerogative to get us started? But gentleman at the back.
Hi, I wonder if your data includes supplier-side risk. So you've got a good set of data on sellers, but on the buyer side, it's increasingly becoming a risk for us to not know the sort of supply, everything in the supply chain.
You're absolutely right, and the answer to that is yes. Every supplier in our database has been mapped to a proper company using the Companies House and Moody's APIs. And for each supplier in our database, there's a credit rating, for example, there's a credit outlook. So one of the appeals of using Tussell for people like Westminster, Essex, Camden, Surrey, Suffolk is better insight not only to their expiring contracts. Often it's easier for councils to find that in our database than in their own data. They can also benchmark their purchasing patterns to other similar local authorities or NHS trusts, and they can also filter all of their suppliers based, for example, on their credit rating as a kind of, and if you saw that you had £5 million worth of business coming up for renewal in the next 6 months with a group of suppliers all categorized as at risk from a credit point of view, that might well be a trigger to try and, swap out a supplier that you might otherwise have just kind of, extended. I hope that answers the question.
Any more questions from the floor? In which case, gentleman down the front here.
Thanks. I haven't done the rounds to check. There's no colleagues from Crown Commercial Services here. Run the risk of getting blacklisted. But we feel that in the last year or so, there's been a marked kind of drop in transparency, certainly with kind of a rise of more private frameworks, kind of digital solutions and platforms. And I guess the bringing in of DOS 6 and some of the tooling and systems that support the transparency there. Do you think there's any kind of acceptance of that in government and momentum to bring some of that back? Or are we going to continue to have to rely on kind of personal networks and that kind of alternative sources of information?
I think you're bang on. I think there has been a bit of kind of dilution in transparency. I think the government is aware of that. I happen to know that because I was sitting on a call with the Cabinet Office Transparency team a couple of weeks ago talking about exactly this. I think there is the ambition to tackle that. The progress, I think, will, like everything in government, be gradual. It's my job to kind of take the world as it is. It would be really easy to beat up the government for not doing this, that, and the other. In most cases, though, by international standards, the UK is very transparent. And, for all of you in the room, you can either focus on, the 10% of insight that might be missing, or you can focus on the 10%, the 90%, which is up for grabs, and start making better decisions on that, whether you're a buyer and you want to make sure that you're working with the best suppliers, or you're a supplier and you want to be, tapping the best customers. I will say one other thing, which is slightly less vague. We do actually count the CCS and the Cabinet Office as long-standing customers. And one way that I know that the Cabinet Office is serious about tackling this stuff is that they actually use our data to audit their own transparency and compliance. And they bother to do that in order to have an evidence base with which to go back to ministerial bodies with proof around where the gaps are. So it's imperfect, but I think the will is there, and in time we'll get there.
Great. Gentleman right at the very back.
Thank you. Is there a small danger of herd mentality? Like in the 80s, people said no one ever got fired for buying IBM. So if successful suppliers will maintain their dominance because they are the dominant suppliers?
I would fall back on the data. IBM is within that cohort of companies in the orange line. So I'm
valued techUK member that they are.
They're a techUK member. They are a long-standing customer of ours. I'm not saying that they are within that orange line. There are companies growing quite quickly, and there are some who are losing market share. And this is not an attack on any of them. They actually, they're earning about the same amount of revenue, but they're not really kind of keeping up with the market. And so it's as per the headline, the supply landscape is evolving quite significantly. I don't think it's talked about much, but I think the government deserves credit for supplier diversification, for contract disaggregation. It's not yet getting as much as it would like directly into the hands of SMEs, but the big incumbents today are not the same as the big incumbents 5 years ago. So within that, there's a plethora of stories, but I think now is a good time to be an agile company selling an innovative and above all useful solution to government. I spend a lot of time talking to buyers and suppliers, as you can imagine, and I don't come across anybody in the public sector that has a closed door to people who can really help them to save money and save time and improve the services that they're trying to deliver to citizens.
Gus, I think that is the perfect place to leave this session. So thank you very much for your insight. As you said, you've got to stand outside as well. But please join me in thanking Gus for a very insightful session.
Thank you very much.